There is no photograph of Die Glocke, no blueprint, no test log, no budget record. For a device that allegedly bent gravity and distorted time, it left behind an unusual amount of nothing. And yet the story is remarkably specific. According to the legend, deep underground in wartime Germany, the SS tested a bell-shaped machine built from heavy metal alloys. Inside it rotated a strange, mercury-like substance. Witnesses reportedly became ill or died. Experiments ended abruptly. Scientists disappeared. The device was dismantled or destroyed as the war collapsed. It sounds technical, dangerous, secret enough to be believable. The problem is simple. Every detail of Die Glocke comes from a single post-war narrative, not from wartime records. That alone places it in a strange category. The Third Reich documented everything. Research projects required approval, funding, materials transport, guards, power supply, and personnel. Even failed experiments left paper trails, especially those run by the SS. A machine capable of rewriting physics would not have existed outside that system. It would have demanded resources Germany no longer had by the final years of the war. Still, the legend insists Die Glocke was real, precisely because no evidence survived. The absence of proof becomes the proof itself. A familiar logic in conspiracy thinking. The location usually cited strengthens the illusion. Late in the war, Germany did move factories underground. Mines and tunnels in Silesia and Bavaria were converted into industrial sites. Secret weapons programs were relocated to avoid Allied bombing. This part is real. What is not real is the leap from underground production to time manipulation. Die Glocke is often grouped with the Nazi Wunderwaffe obsession, the belief that a single breakthrough could reverse total defeat. Jet fighters, long-range rockets, and experimental submarines did exist. None of them changed the outcome of the war. The bell, unlike those projects, appears only later, when the war is already over and the archives are largely open. That timing matters. The legend of Die Glocke does not emerge from documents, trials, or captured files. It appears decades later in a climate shaped by the Cold War, nuclear anxiety, and fascination with secret technologies. A period when science itself felt dangerous and poorly understood by the public. A Nazi time machine fit the mood perfectly. It offered an explanation that was dramatic but safe, mysterious but bloodless, complex enough to discourage verification, and it reframed history in a subtle way. If the Nazis were defeated despite possessing almost supernatural technology, then their power seemed less human, and their crimes less ordinary. Responsibility shifted from ideology and systems to forbidden science. That is the real function of Die Glocke, not as a machine, but as a myth that replaces uncomfortable truths with technical mystery. It suggests that the Third Reich was undone not by its own contradictions, but by a miracle that arrived too late. This story is not about whether the Nazis built a device that controlled time. It is about why so many people want to believe they did, because believing in Die Glocke requires far less effort than confronting how ordinary, bureaucratic, and human real evil actually was. And that, in the end, may be the most dangerous illusion of all. By the final years of the Second World War, Germany was losing. Not symbolically, not strategically, but mathematically. It was losing pilots faster than it could train them, fuel faster than it could refine it, cities faster than it could rebuild them. And most importantly, it was losing time. At that point, believing in the impossible was no longer irrational. It was efficient. This was the moment when the concept of the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon, stopped being propaganda and became a psychological necessity. The idea was simple. Germany did not need to win the war conventionally. It needed one breakthrough, one device, one leap so dramatic that it would erase years of strategic failure overnight. The logic was flawed, but emotionally irresistible. The regime had already conditioned its population to expect miracles. Blitzkrieg itself had been sold as a revolutionary way of war, fast, overwhelming, unstoppable. Early victories reinforced the illusion that Germany possessed not just better soldiers, but superior methods, superior minds, superior destiny. When that illusion began to crack, the response was not humility. It was escalation. If tanks were no longer enough, the answer was bigger tanks. If aircraft were intercepted, the answer was faster aircraft. If cities were bombed, the answer was weapons that could not be stopped at all. Rockets, jets, submarines that stayed underwater indefinitely, and eventually, ideas that moved beyond weapons entirely. Ideas that promised to bypass physics itself. This is where Die Glocke fits in, not as a real machine, but as the logical endpoint of Wunderwaffe thinking. By 1943 to 1944, the German leadership was fully aware that conventional victory was no longer realistic. Allied production outpaced Germany by orders of magnitude. The United States alone was producing aircraft, ships, and vehicles at a scale the Reich could not match even in its best years. So the question shifted. Not how do we win, but how do we avoid losing the way everyone expects us to? That question created space for fantasy. The political pressure was enormous. Hitler demanded results while refusing to hear bad news. Failures were punished. Doubt was framed as sabotage. Engineers and scientists learned quickly that pessimistic realism was dangerous, while optimism, even unfounded optimism, was rewarded. In that environment, projects did not need to work. They needed to sound like they might. A weapon that promised marginal improvement could be ignored. A weapon that promised total reversal could not. And so the Reich invested disproportionate hope in ideas that bypassed normal constraints: range, fuel, interception, manpower. The more desperate the situation became, the more attractive these ideas grew. Reality had failed them. Miracles had not. The SS in particular thrived in this atmosphere. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which still had to deal with logistics and battlefield reality, the SS operated in a more ideological space. It was less concerned with feasibility and more with symbolism, prestige, and internal power. And at the center of that world stood Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was not an engineer. He was not a scientist. He did not understand physics in any meaningful sense. What he did understand was narrative. He saw the SS not merely as a military organization, but as the core of a future civilization, a new order with its own rituals, myths, and sources of legitimacy. Science, in that vision, was not about testing hypotheses. It was about proving destiny. That distinction mattered. Projects associated with the SS often existed in a conceptual gray zone between research, ideology, and theater. Archaeology was used to prove racial myths. History was rewritten to support pre-selected conclusions. Pseudoscience was tolerated, even encouraged, if it reinforced belief. In this ecosystem, a device like Die Glocke makes psychological sense. A bell-shaped machine that supposedly defied gravity and time did not need to function. It needed to signal supremacy. It fit perfectly into Himmler's worldview: secret knowledge, ancient symbolism, modern power, and absolute separation from the rational norms of the outside world. The irony, of course, is hard to miss. While fantasies of miracle devices circulated, Germany struggled to keep its trains running. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Factories lacked raw materials. Entire weapons programs collapsed not because they were intercepted, but because they could not be supplied. The regime that dreamed of bending time could not manage coal distribution. But this contradiction did not weaken belief in miracles. It strengthened it. Because when systems fail, people stop trusting systems. They begin to look for shortcuts, for exceptions, for something that does not follow the rules, that have betrayed them. This is not unique to Nazi Germany. History offers countless parallels. Late-stage empires often turned to technological salvation myths. In the Cold War, both superpowers invested in doomsday concepts that promised absolute security through absolute destruction. In more recent times, struggling states have embraced unproven superweapons, revolutionary doctrines, or vague next-generation technologies as substitutes for structural reform. The pattern is consistent. When reality becomes politically inconvenient, imagination becomes policy. Die Glocke, as a concept, reflects this perfectly. It represents the moment when the idea of winning a war stopped being tied to strategy and became an article of faith. A belief that the right device, hidden in the right place, could override economics, manpower, geography, and time itself. This is why Die Glocke is always described as secret, even by Nazi standards. Its supposed invisibility is part of its appeal. If no one can verify it, no one can disprove it either. And that ambiguity was useful. For those inside the system, it justified continued loyalty. For those outside it, it preserved the image of a Reich that fell not because it was flawed, but because its greatest weapons arrived too late. That framing matters, because it quietly shifts responsibility away from ideology and toward fate. It turns human decisions into tragic inevitability. It replaces accountability with mystery. By the end of the war, Germany did not need functioning miracle weapons to survive psychologically. It needed the belief that such weapons almost existed. Die Glocke fits neatly into that need. It belongs not to the laboratories of wartime Germany, but to its collapsing imagination, a place where science blurred into myth, and myth became a coping mechanism. The bell did not need to ring. People only needed to believe it might have. Every great conspiracy starts with one unverified source. In the case of Die Glocke, that source is not a leaked SS archive, not a captured Allied intelligence file, and not a post-war trial transcript. It is a book, published decades after the war, written by a single author, based on claims that cannot be independently confirmed. That detail changes everything. The modern Die Glocke legend enters the historical record in the late 20th century through the work of Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist and military researcher. His book presented Die Glocke as a suppressed Nazi superweapon, developed in secret, tested underground, and erased from official memory as the Reich collapsed. The story was compelling. It was also isolated. No parallel accounts existed in German archives. No Allied intelligence reports mentioned such a device. No Soviet documents referred to it, despite extensive efforts to seize German technology and scientists in 1945. No surviving engineers ever described working on it. No funding trails led to it. No transport records hinted at its movement. What existed was a narrative, and a reader willing to follow it. This is where the Die Glocke story becomes less about Nazi technology and more about how modern myths are constructed. Witkowski's account relied heavily on alleged post-war testimonies and secondary interpretations. He described secret facilities, SS oversight, and extraordinary experiments involving a mysterious mercury-like substance. The tone suggested access to hidden knowledge, just enough detail to feel authoritative, but never enough to be checked. Crucially, no primary documents were reproduced. There were no photographs of the device, no diagrams, no contracts, no requisition orders, no correspondence between departments. For a regime that recorded the serial numbers of office furniture, this silence is not subtle. It is deafening. Defenders of the legend often argue that Die Glocke was too secret to be documented. This argument sounds persuasive until examined closely. Even the Manhattan Project, the most secret scientific undertaking of the 20th century, generated mountains of paperwork. Thousands of documents, budgets, memos, security protocols, personnel files, and logistics records survived. Extreme secrecy does not eliminate bureaucracy. It multiplies it. The SS, in particular, was not an informal organization. It thrived on hierarchy, documentation, and internal competition. Projects required authorization. Authorization required justification. Justification required paperwork. A device capable of killing scientists, emitting radiation, and supposedly altering gravity would have demanded extraordinary oversight. Medical reports, safety measures, personnel rotation, power supply calculations, structural reinforcement, waste disposal. None of these appear anywhere. The absence is not accidental. It is structural. When historians search for evidence, they do not look for sensational claims. They look for traces, indirect references, budget anomalies, shipping logs, mentions in unrelated files, a shadow cast by the object, even if the object itself is gone. Die Glocke casts no shadow. This is the turning point where the legend should end. Instead, it accelerates. Because once a story enters popular culture, it no longer needs verification. It needs repetition. Other authors cite Witkowski. Documentaries cite those authors. Online articles cite the documentaries. The source becomes diluted, obscured, and eventually forgotten. What remains is the illusion of consensus. This is how a single, unverified claim becomes widely reported. The lack of evidence is then reframed as evidence of suppression. The more historians point out the absence of records, the more believers insist those records were destroyed. Any contradiction becomes proof of conspiracy. This circular logic is not unique to Die Glocke. It is the standard operating system of modern conspiracy theory. A claim is made. Verification is impossible. Skepticism is treated as hostility. Silence is treated as confirmation. At that point, the story no longer belongs to history. It belongs to belief. There is also a more practical issue rarely addressed in popular accounts: financing. Late-war Germany was bankrupt in every meaningful sense. Strategic bombing crippled industry. Fuel shortages paralyzed transport. Labor shortages were masked by forced labor, which further degraded productivity. Even prioritized weapons programs struggled to secure materials. Yet Die Glocke is described as requiring rare metals, exotic compounds, secure underground facilities, specialized personnel, and extended testing, all without leaving a financial footprint. This is not how large-scale research works. Not then, not now. Even failed German weapons programs left trails. The V2 program alone consumed enormous resources and produced extensive documentation. Jet aircraft programs, despite being rushed and flawed, are well documented down to individual components. Die Glocke, allegedly more revolutionary than all of them combined, appears to have operated entirely outside the economic reality of the Reich. That is not secrecy. That is fantasy. There is also the problem of personnel. German scientists were aggressively interrogated after the war by Allied and Soviet teams. Engineers, physicists, chemists. Anyone remotely connected to advanced research was questioned, recruited, or monitored. Many were outspoken. Some were bitter. Others were eager to trade information for protection. None mentioned Die Glocke. Not privately, not publicly, not accidentally. For a project that supposedly killed its own staff and involved extreme hazards, this silence is implausible. Human beings talk, especially when regimes collapse and loyalties dissolve. The Die Glocke legend requires an unlikely level of discipline from people who had nothing left to lose. At this point, the pattern becomes clear. The story does not survive because of evidence. It survives because it is narratively efficient. It explains Germany's technological reputation without confronting its limitations. It preserves the image of Nazi power without addressing its logistical failures. It replaces mundane collapse with dramatic secrecy. Most importantly, it shifts the focus away from ideology. A time-bending machine is more interesting than a bureaucratic system of mass murder. A mysterious bell is easier to discuss than ordinary men following orders. The myth is cleaner, safer, less demanding. And that is why Die Glocke continues to circulate. Not because it was real, but because it fills a psychological gap left by the war. A gap between what people want history to be and what it actually was. One unverified source was enough. It always is. Because once a story no longer depends on proof, it becomes immune to reality. And that is when a myth stops asking to be believed and starts asking to be defended. If Die Glocke has a physical home, it is almost always placed underground. Specifically, beneath a former mining and industrial site near Ludwikowice Klodzkie, a location that appears again and again in books, documentaries, and online maps marked with arrows and ominous labels. Concrete rings, collapsed tunnels, abandoned structures photographed in gray light. To believers, these remains are evidence of something extraordinary. To historians and engineers, they are evidence of something far more familiar. Late war German industry. By 1943, Allied bombing had made above-ground production increasingly impossible. Aircraft factories, fuel plants, and weapons facilities were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Germany's response was not mysterious or innovative. It was logistical. Move underground. Mines, tunnels, and unfinished excavation projects were repurposed at enormous human cost. Prisoners, forced laborers, and concentration camp inmates were used to carve production halls out of rock. Ventilation systems were installed. Electrical lines were laid. Concrete supports were poured quickly and often poorly. The goal was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was survival. Underground facilities protected machinery from bombing, stabilized temperatures, and allowed limited production to continue even as cities burned above. This shift created the visual language that later conspiracy theories would exploit. Darkness, depth, isolation. But underground does not mean unknown. The sites around Ludwikowice were part of a broader pattern of dispersed industrial activity in Silesia. Archival research shows that these locations were connected to conventional military-industrial projects, not speculative physics experiments. Their primary purpose was testing and manufacturing components for rocket and propulsion systems. This matters because rocket engineering in the 1940s was not clean, elegant, or mystical. It was violent, unstable, and brutally mechanical. Engines exploded, fuels leaked, test stands collapsed. Entire facilities were damaged during trials. What remained afterward often looked dramatic. Scorched concrete, twisted metal, thick containment structures, reinforced foundations. To a modern observer unfamiliar with early propulsion testing, these remnants can easily be mistaken for something else, something exotic. But there is nothing exotic about rocket testing debris. German engineers were working at the edge of material limits. Combustion chambers ran at extreme pressures. Cooling systems failed. Fuels like liquid oxygen and alcohol required strict handling protocols. Explosions were common, sometimes fatal. These were not experiments in time manipulation. They were attempts to make engines survive longer than a few seconds. The facilities needed for this work explain nearly every physical feature later attributed to Die Glocke. Heavy foundations? Required to anchor test stands. Thick concrete rings? Blast containment and vibration damping. Remote locations? Safety and secrecy. Reports of radiation or illness. Chemical exposure? Heavy metals, fuel vapors. No need for pseudoscience. The myth gains momentum because it replaces these explanations with something more appealing. Dirty engineering is unsatisfying. It involves trial and error, failure rates, and incremental progress. It produces results that are impressive only in hindsight. Pseudo-magic, by contrast, promises immediate transformation. It is also worth addressing the Mercury obsession that appears in nearly every Die Glocke retelling. Mercury and mercury-based compounds were widely used in industrial processes during the war. From electrical switches to chemical manufacturing, they are toxic. Prolonged exposure causes neurological damage, organ failure, and death. No temporal distortion required. Workers in poorly ventilated underground facilities handling hazardous substances would have suffered severe health effects. This is documented across multiple wartime industries, not just in Germany. When later authors describe scientists becoming ill or dying near Die Glocke, they unknowingly describe something entirely ordinary for 1940s heavy industry. The difference is framing. Rocket testing deaths are tragic but comprehensible. Time experiments are shocking and unforgettable. Another frequently cited feature is the supposed evacuation of these sites as Allied forces advanced. This, too, is real and unremarkable. As the Eastern Front collapsed, German authorities ordered the relocation of machinery, materials, and personnel westward. Anything that could be dismantled was dismantled. Anything that could be transported was transported. What could not be moved was destroyed or abandoned. This evacuation was chaotic, incomplete, and poorly documented, not because it was secret, but because the state itself was disintegrating. Here again, myth fills the gaps. Missing equipment becomes removed technology. Destroyed infrastructure becomes deliberate erasure. Incomplete records become classified files. In reality, evacuation was a sign of weakness, not power. The contrast becomes stark when we examine what did survive from underground German research. Rocket components, test data, engine designs, personnel lists. All of it was eagerly seized by the Allies. American, Soviet, and British teams competed aggressively to capture scientists and technical documentation. This effort was systematic and relentless. German engineers were interrogated in detail. Facilities were catalogued. Anything of potential value was shipped abroad. And yet, among the thousands of reports produced during this period, Die Glocke does not appear. Not as a device, not as a concept, not even as a rumor worth investigating. This silence is not accidental. If an experimental machine had demonstrated even marginally unusual physical effects, it would have been noticed. Allied intelligence was not allergic to speculative science. On the contrary, it actively searched for breakthroughs that could provide strategic advantage. What they found instead were incomplete projects, overstated claims, and the limits of wartime engineering. The myth of Die Glocke depends on collapsing all underground activity into one category, secret. But secrecy is not the same as mystery. The Underground Reich was not a realm of occult physics. It was a realm of emergency improvisation. Engineers worked under impossible constraints. Labor was coerced. Safety standards collapsed. Efficiency plummeted. This is the opposite of an environment conducive to revolutionary science. Breakthroughs require stability, resources, collaboration, and time, all things Germany lacked in the final years of the war. The irony is sharp. The same ruins used to support Die Glocke mythology actually demonstrate why such a project could not have existed. They show desperation, not transcendence. Collapse, not control. Where conspiracy sees ritual chambers, engineers see test pits. Where myth sees containment rings, physics sees blast protection. Where legend sees erased knowledge, history sees unfinished work. The underground facilities of Silesia were not hiding a machine that bent time. They were hiding Germany's failure to bend reality to its will. And that failure is far more instructive than any imagined miracle, because it reminds us that technology does not operate in isolation. It is bound to economics, labor, materials, and organization. No amount of belief can override those constraints. Die Glocke replaces that uncomfortable truth with a prettier one. Dirty engineering is loud, unstable, and human. Beautiful pseudo-magic is silent, perfect, and imaginary. The minds at Ludwikovice tell us which one actually existed. And once you recognize that difference, the bell loses its echo. The Die Glocke legend did not grow in the ruins of Nazi Germany. It grew in the atmosphere that followed. By the late 1940s, the war was over, but certainty had not returned. Instead, it had been replaced by suspicion. Allies became rivals. Secrets became currency. Science, once a promise of progress, began to feel like a threat. This was the psychological climate in which Die Glocke finally made sense. The Cold War transformed technology into something abstract and frightening. Weapons were no longer just machines. They were symbols of unseen power. Nuclear bombs erased cities without warning. Rockets crossed continents. Espionage replaced armies. And behind it all was a quiet, unsettling question. What did the Germans almost finish? The fear of stolen science became a shared obsession. The Third Reich had collapsed, but its scientists had not disappeared. Many were captured. Many were interrogated. Many were quietly absorbed into new power structures. That process was not a secret. The United States openly ran Operation Paperclip, recruiting German engineers, physicists, and technicians for American research programs. The Soviet Union did the same, often with less ceremony. Britain followed its own version. To the public, this looked unsettling. Former enemies were no longer being punished. They were being hired. Men who had worked for a criminal regime were suddenly experts, consultants, pioneers of the future. The moral accounting felt incomplete. If these scientists were valuable enough to protect, people wondered what knowledge they carried with them. The answer did not need to be precise. It needed to be alarming. Paperclip created a narrative vacuum. Official explanations focused on rockets and aerodynamics. But that felt insufficient, too small, too ordinary. The public wanted something commensurate with the fear of the atomic age. They wanted secrets worthy of the secrecy. This is where Die Glocke enters the story, not as a wartime project, but as a post-war explanation. It suggested that the most dangerous Nazi research was never captured, never documented, never revealed. That something fundamental had slipped through the cracks of history. Something powerful enough to justify extraordinary measures. The Cold War rewarded that kind of thinking. Governments lied, provably. Intelligence agencies manipulated information, openly. Classified projects were revealed decades later, often confirming public suspicions rather than easing them. Trust eroded. Speculation filled the gap. When institutions become opaque, imagination becomes credible. The 1950s and 1960s added another layer: UFOs. Unidentified flying objects were reported across the United States and Europe. Some sightings were misidentified aircraft. Others were experimental jets and high-altitude balloons. A few remained unexplained. In a rational environment, these incidents might have been processed cautiously. This was not a rational environment. The public was already primed to believe in hidden technologies. Rockets existed, jets existed, nuclear weapons existed. The line between advanced science and science fiction was thin, and it was constantly crossed in popular media. When people looked at the sky and saw something unfamiliar, their minds reached for familiar explanations, and Nazi technology was one of them. It offered continuity. If strange machines existed, perhaps they were not new at all. Perhaps they were inherited, recovered, reverse-engineered. Maybe the future was not being invented. Maybe it was being stolen. Die Glocke fit neatly into this framework. A device too strange to reveal, too dangerous to discuss, too powerful to explain. Something that could plausibly connect Nazi Germany, Cold War secrecy, and UFO mythology into a single narrative. It also had another advantage. It removed human agency. A machine that bends time is terrifying, but it is impersonal. It shifts focus away from ideology, choices, and responsibility. It reframes history as a technological accident rather than a moral catastrophe. This mattered more than people realized. accepting that the worst crimes in history were committed by ordinary people, using ordinary tools, for ordinary reasons is deeply uncomfortable. It forces questions that do not age well. How did this happen? Who allowed it? Who benefited? Die Glocke offered an escape. If Nazi power came from forbidden science rather than social systems, then its rise could be treated as an anomaly, a glitch, a dark detour driven by secret knowledge rather than mass participation. In that version of history, evil is exotic, and exotic evil is easier to contain. The irony is that Cold War secrecy made this explanation feel responsible. Governments were clearly hiding things. Files were classified. Projects were compartmentalized. Entire operations were denied until they were accidentally confirmed. Against that background, a hidden Nazi superweapon felt plausible by default. What people often forget is that secrecy does not equal sophistication. Most classified projects are hidden, not because they are miraculous, but because they are unfinished, embarrassing, or politically sensitive. The majority of Cold War research produced incremental improvements, dead ends, and failures, not reality-breaking breakthroughs. But incremental progress does not capture the imagination. Die Glocke did. It promised that history had a missing chapter, one that could explain lingering anxiety about power, science, and morality. It suggested that something was unresolved, that the past was not really past, and it provided a villain that felt appropriately dramatic. A time machine is easier to fear than a bureaucracy. A glowing device is easier to remember than meeting minutes. A bell is easier to mythologize than a filing cabinet. This is why Die Glocke flourished in the post-war decades, not during the war itself. It is a Cold War myth wearing a Nazi uniform. It belongs to an era when science fiction bled into national security, when the future felt unstable, and when governments demonstrated, repeatedly, that they were willing to lie in the name of protection. In that world, believing in a secret Nazi machine did not feel irrational. It felt cautious. And it was far easier to believe in a stolen miracle than to accept a far more disturbing truth: that no advanced technology was required, that no forbidden physics was involved, that the greatest horrors of the 20th century were produced by organization, obedience, and ideology, not by machines that bent time. Die Glocke survives because it softens that reality. It replaces banality with mystery, responsibility with speculation, history with legend. And once a myth performs that function, it becomes very difficult to let go, because letting go would mean admitting that evil does not need miracles. It only needs people willing to look away. If Die Glocke existed as described, it would have required physics that did not merely exceed 1940s science. It would still exceed modern science. That does not automatically make it impossible, but it does place it in a very specific category: claims that require extraordinary evidence, not atmospheric storytelling. When stripped of mystique, Die Glocke is usually said to do three things: defy gravity, distort time, and use mercury-like substances and radiation as a power source. Each of these claims can be tested against what physics actually allows, not emotionally, but mechanically. Start with gravity. Anti-gravity is one of those terms that sounds technical, but explains nothing. It appears often in science fiction and conspiracy literature precisely because it feels intuitive. Gravity pulls down, so anti-gravity must push up. Physics does not work that way. Gravity is not a force that can be switched off or reversed with a device. In modern physics, gravity is the curvature of space-time caused by mass and energy. To counter it, you do not need a clever machine. You need either enormous mass, enormous energy, or acceleration. We already know how to cancel gravity in practical terms. Rockets, aircraft, centrifuges. All of them rely on brute force, not exotic physics. They consume fuel, generate heat, and obey Newtonian mechanics. Any device capable of neutralizing gravity locally, without propulsion, would require energy densities comparable to astrophysical phenomena, black holes, neutron stars, or conditions found only at cosmic scales. Nazi Germany struggled to produce enough aviation fuel. This is the first hard stop. There is no theoretical framework, classical or modern, in which a bell-shaped device, built with 1940s materials, could generate controlled anti-gravitational effects. Not then. Not now. Claims that unknown physics was involved simply move the problem, they do not solve it. Unknown physics still leaves traces. It still interacts with matter. It still produces measurable effects. Die Glocke allegedly produced none that survived. Time distortion is not a fringe idea. It exists, but only in very specific, extreme contexts. Einstein's relativity predicts time dilation at high speeds and in strong gravitational fields. GPS satellites must account for it daily. Astronauts experience it in tiny amounts. But the key word is tiny. Meaningful time distortion requires velocities approaching the speed of light, or gravitational fields so intense they border on cosmic collapse. These are not engineering problems. They are cosmological conditions. There is no known way to produce such effects in a laboratory-sized device without energy levels far beyond any industrial capacity, even today. When Die Glocke stories suggest localized time anomalies, they quietly skip the part where the required inputs would vaporize the facility, the surrounding rock, and likely the planet's immediate environment. This is not a matter of secrecy. It is a matter of scale. The same applies to alleged side effects: disorientation, sickness, death. These are described as signs of temporal exposure. In reality, they align far more closely with chemical poisoning, radiation exposure, or pressure-related trauma, all well documented in early industrial and military research. No time machine required. The most persistent physical detail in Die Glocke accounts is the use of a mercury-like substance, sometimes described as glowing, rotating, or highly radioactive. This detail is often treated as the story's strongest point. It is actually its weakest. Mercury was widely used in the 20th century. It appears in electrical systems, chemical processing, explosives manufacturing, and scientific instruments. It is toxic, volatile, and dangerous in enclosed spaces. So are many substances used in wartime industry. Radiation exposure, likewise, was poorly understood in the 1940s. Safety standards were minimal. Shielding was inadequate. Workers frequently handled radioactive or chemically hazardous materials without protection. People got sick. People died. Facilities were abandoned. This is not speculation. It is documented industrial history. There is no known configuration in which mercury becomes a power source capable of manipulating gravity or time. It does not matter whether it spins, vibrates, or glows. These are visual descriptors, not mechanisms. Calling mercury a fuel is like calling steam a magic mist. It confuses by analogy, rather than explaining by function. Perhaps the most telling issue is that Die Glocke does not map onto any theoretical framework, even speculative ones. There is no proposed equation, no principle, no consistent explanation of cause and effect. The device is said to do something extraordinary, but never how it does it. Contrast this with real breakthroughs. Even failed or incorrect scientific ideas leave intellectual trails. Ether theory, phlogiston, early atomic models, all were wrong, but internally consistent. They generated predictions that could be tested and disproven. Die Glocke generates none. It exists as a result, not a process. That is a critical distinction. Real science argues about mechanisms. Pseudoscience argues about outcomes. The bell allegedly bent time. End of explanation. This places it outside not only known physics, but also the culture of physics. Scientists argue obsessively about details. They publish partial results, They disagree publicly. They leave behind drafts, notes, rival theories. None of this exists here. And again, secrecy does not explain that absence. Even classified research leaves internal disagreement, failed prototypes, marginal data. Silence at this level is not secrecy. It is non-existence. Die Glocke fits a recurring pattern. During periods of technological anxiety, societies produce stories about devices that transcend rules. In the late 19th century, it was perpetual motion machines. In the early Cold War, it was mind control, death rays, and weather weapons. Later, it became zero-point energy and free energy generators. These claims always share features: vague terminology, extreme effects, absence of reproducible evidence, reliance on suppressed knowledge. They flourish, not because they are plausible, but because they address uncertainty. The atomic bomb proved that physics could be terrifying. That alone was enough to convince people that anything might be possible, especially if hidden. But possibility is not proof. And physics is unforgiving in this respect. It does not care about narrative timing, moral symbolism, or ideological collapse. It cares about energy, mass, interaction, and constraint. Die Glocke violates all four without offering a replacement model. This is not about defending science as an authority. It is about recognizing its limits. If Die Glocke had existed, it would not just be a historical curiosity. It would be the most important scientific discovery in human history. It would invalidate entire fields. It would rewrite textbooks from the ground up. Such a discovery cannot disappear without consequences. It would echo. It would be rediscovered independently. It would manifest in later research. It would leave fingerprints in unexpected places. None exist. That is not a failure of imagination. It is a failure of evidence. And that failure is decisive. The calm conclusion is therefore simple. There is no physical principle, classical, relativistic, quantum, or speculative, that supports the operation of Die Glocke as described. There is no material basis for its alleged effects. There is no theoretical scaffold to hang it on. What remains is not a misunderstood machine, but a story that borrows scientific language to avoid scientific accountability. Believing in a Nazi time machine is easier than accepting that nothing mystical was required. Because if physics offers no miracle, then history must be explained the hard way, through systems, choices, and human behavior. And that explanation is far less comfortable. Die Glocke survives not because it explains the past, but because it simplifies it. It answers questions people keep asking, not with facts, but with atmosphere. It offers a single object to focus fear, curiosity, and unresolved discomfort. And it does so without demanding moral reckoning. That is why the legend still circulates decades after every relevant archive has been opened. Die Glocke is not sustained by evidence. It is sustained by usefulness. For the image of Nazism itself, the myth is strangely protective. A regime that built a time machine appears fundamentally different from a regime that organized mass murder through bureaucracy. One suggests forbidden genius. The other suggests frightening normality. The bell recasts Nazi power as almost supernatural. It implies that the Third Reich did not simply dominate through ideology, violence, and compliance, but through access to hidden forces beyond ordinary human reach. That framing matters. If the Nazis were defeated despite possessing extraordinary technology, then their fall becomes tragic rather than deserved. They lost not because their system was corrupt and self-destructive, but because their greatest weapon arrived too late. This is a subtle rehabilitation, not of people but of perception. It shifts focus away from responsibility and toward mystery, away from choices and toward destiny. It replaces accountability with a sense of cosmic near-miss. For modern audiences, the myth serves a different purpose. Die Glocke turns historical horror into a puzzle, something to be decoded rather than confronted. It invites speculation instead of reflection. The suffering of millions becomes background noise to a technological riddle. A glowing machine is easier to imagine than starving prisoners. A secret experiment is easier to discuss than mass graves. Mysticism softens the edge of reality. There is also comfort in believing that evil required something extraordinary. If the Nazis needed time machines, occult knowledge, or forbidden physics to commit their crimes, then ordinary people are implicitly excluded from responsibility. Evil becomes rare, specialized, and external. That belief is reassuring. It allows audiences to place moral distance between themselves and history, to believe that we could never repeat such things, because we do not possess such terrible secrets. But history does not support that conclusion. No advanced technology was required. No hidden science was involved. The machinery of the Holocaust ran on paperwork, obedience, logistics, and indifference. Die Glocke obscures that reality. The myth also benefits from how it adapts. It absorbs new anxieties without changing its core. During the Cold War, it connected to nuclear fear. During the UFO era, it aligned with sightings and secret aircraft. In the digital age, it blends with online conspiracy culture and algorithmic amplification. It is flexible, portable, and endlessly remixable. Most importantly, it cannot be disproven in the way its believers define proof. Every absence becomes confirmation. Every contradiction becomes suppression. Every demand for evidence is treated as hostility. This makes Die Glocke a closed system, immune to correction. And that is precisely why it works. The legend is not meant to be resolved. It is meant to persist. The real power of Die Glocke was never technology. It was belief. Belief that transforms lack of evidence into intrigue. Belief that elevates fantasy over documentation. Belief that replaces uncomfortable truths with cinematic alternatives. In that sense, Die Glocke is not a failed weapon. It is a successful narrative. There was no bell beneath the earth that bent time, no machine hidden from history that could rewrite physics. What existed was something far more dangerous and far more ordinary. A system that rewarded loyalty over truth. A culture that replaced evidence with ideology. A society willing to accept myths rather than examine itself. Die Glocke did not vanish because it was destroyed. It never existed to begin with, but the conditions that created it did exist, and those conditions can return. That is the final lesson. When fear outpaces understanding, myths flourish. When science becomes incomprehensible to the public, mysticism fills the gap. When accountability is uncomfortable, mystery feels safer. The bell continues to echo because it absolves. It suggests that history went wrong because of secrets, not choices. Because of machines, not people. Letting go of Die Glocke means accepting something far more unsettling. That the greatest horrors of the modern world required no miracles at all, only belief, and people willing to follow it.